Hi, managing secrets and configuration. In this section, we will demonstrate configuration best practices for managing Kubernetes configuration. We'll create and decode some secrets, and we'll use secrets in applications. Video 1. Configuration best practices. In this video, we will demonstrate tips for configuration best practices, and we'll also discuss best practices for labeling, managing secrets, taints and tolerations, compute resource management, and pod priority. What is considered configuration in Kubernetes? So in Kubernetes, configuration is considered the API objects, defined in YAML or JSON, that we create using the kubectl or API. An example of a configuration file is a hello app deployment.yaml file that specifies a deployment API object. This file would be stored in a Git repository along with your other configuration files. As you can see, the example Kubernetes configuration file below, that's the deployment configuration file. So best practices. Number 1, always specify the latest stable API version. Store configuration and version control, like GitHub. As you can see below, when we create the API resource, we're actually pointing to a remote location. So that's a good practice. It's better to use YAML than JSON simply because YAML is easier to read. There's fewer characters. You don't have to play around with quotes and brackets and things like that. It's just very simple. So YAML is the preferred syntax for storing configuration. Related API objects can be grouped into a single YAML file. So in YAML, you might be familiar with this -- symbol in the file. And what this is going to do, it's going to actually separate the different objects. So up above we have a service object, and then we do -- and then below that we have our deployment object, and we can specify more than one API object in a YAML file. So don't specify default values unnecessarily. For instance, here we have replicas is equal to 1. That's the default value, so we don't have to add fields with default values. It's not necessarily needed. Some other best practices to consider are to create your service objects before creating your replication controller objects. Limit your use of specifying a host port, and use multiple labels to identify semantic attributes. And these best practices are recommended by the Kubernetes organization themselves. Some other best practices to consider also are use the kubectl-f create directory. When you create API resources, specify a directory where possible. Don't add parameters to the command itself. This is so we can do things like a rollback if needed, easily rollback. And we can use the kubectl to delete rather than stop, because delete offers a superset of the functionality of stop is deprecated. So the kubectl run command is used to quickly expose and create a single container deployment. So earlier when we were actually doing our first deployment, we did use the run command rather than specifying a deployment command. And the run command is a convenience command. Let's go ahead and cover node affinity, taints, and tolerations. So with Kubernetes, we can essentially tell the platform. We have a way for taints and tolerations give us a method for telling pods, which node to go to. So taints and tolerations work together to ensure that pods are not scheduled onto inappropriate nodes. Node affinity is a property of pods that attracts and repels them to a set of nodes. So taints are applied to nodes, while tolerations are applied to pods.